I'm Mark Golub, and the Israeli political scene remains in a state of disarray. After the Israeli president, Reuven Rivlin, gave Benjamin Netanyahu an opportunity to create the next coalition government, which would be his fifth term as prime minister. Mr. Netanyahu wasn't able to put together a coalition of parties that would give him the requisite majority of at least 61 seats in the 120-seat Knesset, the Israeli parliament. And so, again, the Israeli people will go to the polls in a second national election within 5 months. Why was Mr. Netanyahu unable to put a coalition together? Who stood in his way? What were the issues that were the roadblocks? What's likely to happen after another round of elections this coming September? And what's it all mean, not only for the state of Israel, but for American Jewry and the relationship between American Jews and the state of Israel? For some answers, I'm pleased to be joined by three astute analysts of Jewish life and the American Jewish scene. Let me introduce them to you. Thane Rosenbaum is a distinguished fellow at NYU Law School. He's the director of the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. And Thane is an award-winning novelist and essayist who can be seen in secular and Jewish publications commenting on issues of Jewish importance. Laura E. Adkins is the opinion editor of the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. Laura previously served as the deputy opinion editor at the Jewish Forward. And Heather Robinson is an independent journalist and a contributor to the daily newspaper in New York City, the New York Post. It is so lovely to have all three of you joining me. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thane, why did this happen? What's it mean?
I think Netanyahu was signaling during the election that this might happen. He dreaded this day. He just didn't know how to explain it, what he was fearing. Remember, just before the elections, he was reaching out to voters on the right wing who were already committed to one of the right-wing parties. And he was saying, you know, vote for Likud. Don't vote for them. I understand that we're not exactly your cup of tea, but vote for us because...
Don't vote for whom?
Don't vote for either the ultra-religious parties, United Torah Judaism, Shas, and certainly Lieberman's Israel Beitenu. And he was speaking specifically about this problem, which is, I think, what he was essentially saying was, and remember, the leaders of those parties were offended that he was doing this, because he was essentially saying, look, if you vote for those parties, you're ultimately voting for me anyway, because I'm going to be prime minister. So just vote for me and get it over with. And what he didn't want to say was, because I may not be able to pull off a coalition with these guys. Why? Because although we're part of the right wing, we have disparate views, especially on very key principal issues. Mm-hmm. And so I think he anticipated, and Lieberman has already abandoned him once. Remember, he was once the defense minister in the prior Netanyahu administration, and he left. So obviously, Lieberman has no problem withdrawing from government to take a position. And I think he thought, well, Lieberman, if he picks up 5 or 6 seats in the Knesset, he's the wild card. He may not stay with me. And he also probably anticipated this religious versus secular issue, which has been dogging the Israelis now for many, many years.
Namely?
Well, there's so many issues, but in this case,
there's one overriding.
This has to do with whether Haredi, religious Jews, should be serving in the IDF. Mm-hmm. Historically, going back to David Ben-Gurion's era, there was a kind of grand bargain being made, which says, we will let you study and learn the Torah, but you need to sign up being part of this system. You can't just be talking about the Messiah. You have to accept the fact that there is it is a secular government that you're living under. But we'll give you this concession. Your kids don't have to serve in the...
Exactly right.
And Lieberman, who represents, among other things, the Soviet Jewry bloc, who, first of all, are warriors. They're really good at the IDF. Number one. Number two, they were raised in a godless country, so their Judaism is less significant to them. And the religious parties have ticked them off by also picking on the former Soviet Jews as saying, you're not really Jews. We're not even sure how many of you are actual Jews. So you can imagine a Soviet Jew saying, what do you mean I'm not a Jew? What do you mean I'm not, in your mind, authentically Jewish? So this core issue became the red hot button. Lieberman was passing a bill through the Knesset, which was called the draft legislation. The idea was to end the exemption that Haredi had in serving in the military and to start creating enlistment quotas so that every year there would be more and more Haredi joining the IDF. The IDF, the Haredi's position is, whatever happened to the grand bargain with Ben-Gurion, I think they were saying, we got 16 votes, and that's important to Netanyahu, and we can leverage those votes.
16 seats in the Knesset.
Right, 16 seats in the Knesset.
Correct.
Combined, if you combine the 3 or 4 of those religious parties. Lieberman only had 5. They had 16. People thought before the election that what the religious parties were really focusing on was the annexation of the West Bank, because that was also an issue. Remember, shortly before the election.
But it wasn't in the end.
It wasn't
Right.
in the end. In the end, what really came down to, and we saw it because it became its own powder keg, is this military conscription law.
Laura, as you look at the issue, why was Netanyahu unable to form a coalition government? What stood in his way from your perspective?
So it's interesting. My analysis is actually quite different. There's a very obvious ideological partner that Netanyahu has that would be the easiest way to a coalition, and that is Benny Gantz's Blue and White Party. Why are they not forming a coalition together? They're virtually indistinguishable, except for one issue, and that issue is the reason they can't form a coalition, which is that Benny Gantz campaigned on Netanyahu's corruption scandals. In every other way, they're virtually indistinguishable. Netanyahu himself is actually kind of standing in the way because he doesn't just need to form a coalition. He needs to form a coalition that is going to keep him from getting indicted, or at least keep him immune from getting removed from his position
How is
if
that
he is
possible?
indicted. Well, there's 2 pieces of legislation that he is really trying to get passed, and one of them would give him immunity from being indicted. Another, again, these are hypothetical because they haven't passed. Another would allow the Knesset to ignore recommendations from the Supreme Court on administrative matters. And if he got some combination of those 2 things passed, even if he were indicted for his 3 corruption scandals, he could still remain prime minister.
Okay. And whom was he worried would not support that he needed?
It's more that the reason that he can't form a coalition with his closest ideological allies is because of this corruption.
I almost understand what you're saying. Ultimately, Netanyahu has to form a coalition of 61 seats.
Correct.
Okay. Normally, it's called a right-wing coalition. And the coalition is going to include the ultra-Orthodox parties. And then the question is, whom else? We saw Kachlon, Moshe Kachlon, who at one point said he would never work with Netanyahu.
Right.
They made a deal. And now Kachlon said he was going to become part of the Likud coalition, and he was number 5, in rank number 5, and he get 3 other seats. So he had Kachlon, and he needed to fill in enough to get to 61.
Right.
When we were looking at this election, no one suggested it was going to be blue and white that would agree to be part of the Likud government.
Right.
He had to find 61 seats, and he had the same number as blue and white. He had roughly 35, 36. He had to get the other, how much would it be? 26.
Right.
He had
Right.
the 26 other members of the Knesset in his coalition. One of the issues was he going to get Avigdor Lieberman?
Right.
What Thane is saying is that although people thought he might get Lieberman, Lieberman
Yeah.
said as recently as yesterday, as we're taping today, no, I'm not going to be part because I will not be part of a coalition that will make any compromise on the
Right.
draft bill.
I'm saying when I look at this election and what a lot of analysts who've been working on this for a long time, I just published a piece from Aaron David Miller showing his analysis of the situation. The only reason that Netanyahu is having to go to his usual coalition partner of the ultra-Orthodox, who he does actually not have that much ideological alignment with, is because of his corruption scandals. So Thane's analysis is absolutely correct. I'm just trying to take a step back.
Okay, I'm only saying this, and enlighten me in this regard. This is a very similar coalition to the ones that have been in the past.
Right.
And corruption was not an issue.
Right. So one of the things that Netanyahu is really good at, and we saw this in 2015, was he's very good at these last-minute efforts to cannibalize right-wing parties. You didn't mention the biggest party he cannibalized this year because they're not in the Knesset, which is Naftali Bennett and Ayelet
How did
Shaked's
he
party.
I've never heard this said. Why do you say he cannibalized? What did he do to them?
Sure. So in actually the last 24 hours, it's astounding. The Likud campaign sent millions of text messages on WhatsApp to people who live in settlement blocks aligned with these more center-right, secular, or religious Zionist parties, encouraging them to vote for Likud, saying that Arabs are coming out in droves to vote, saying your party is not going to hit the threshold, you need to vote Likud if you don't want the left to take over in Israel. So Likud and Netanyahu in particular has been very good at kind of mobilizing people's deep fear of compromising on security issues and leveraging that to take away votes from, ironically, parties who would be in his coalition, like Naftali Bennett's party.
Okay. Heather, as you look at it,
Yes.
from your perspective, why was Netanyahu unable to form a coalition government?
Well, I think that, well, first, I believe it's the first time in Israel's history that a party leader who's been elected hasn't been able to do this.
Third time.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Well, it's the first time they've had to dissolve the Knesset because they simply could not.
Right.
It's
There was
the not-
something
it's a-
unprecedented, I think,
Right,
about
yeah.
this. Of course, in Israel, the election goes by party, and normally the leader has to assemble a coalition. And my understanding, anyway, was that this was a unique situation because typically at that stage, it's not a problem. I mean, I'm coming at this from the perspective of I am a supporter of Bibi, and I take the long view, I guess, the historical one. I think that he is, look, they're all maneuvering, and that's the nature of politics anywhere. And in Israel, politics, like the old joke, you have 2 Jews in a room and you get 10 opinions. I think you could kind of apply the aphorism in a way, in a kind of fun way, because it's very democratic in the sense that you have all these coalitions that need to be established. So smaller parties often have not just a symbolic voice, but a real voice when these decisions happen. And so I think that he has to do some maneuvering in order to hold on to power. So I don't hold that against him. I see that as being part and parcel of what the system requires. And I think that, some people might speculate that there are some saboteurs, these other leaders are operating in their own interest. My take is that I don't think Netanyahu is power crazed. I think he's trying to stay in power because he believes he needs to be the leader to ensure Israel's security, and he's doing what he can. And I think that Lieberman is, I can't speculate as to his motives, but this is certainly, I think Netanyahu views it as an act of sabotage. He's pretty angry, and it's a surprise to him.
It's interesting. I would give Lieberman the same benefit of the doubt that I would give Netanyahu. I will accept what, for Lieberman, is a principle. And he has explained the reason he could not become part of the coalition was that he absolutely wanted a draft law that drafted Haredi into the IDF. And there was an attempt at a last-minute compromise, and the Orthodox said they would make a compromise. Lieberman didn't believe them, and Lieberman said, I'm not here to compromise. This is a non-negotiable issue for me. As far as I'm concerned, the Haredi should be serving in the IDF and should be contributing to the state of Israel as everybody else.
Well, it's a real issue for sure, and it's been for a long
and so
time. Right. So
I want to give Lieberman the same benefit and say, okay, that was his principle. By the way, these are all politicians.
Sure.
They're all politicians. Not one of them is not a politician.
You're saying that he's not necessarily a saboteur. That we
Yeah,
should say to him,
I'm a
this is
little
a
uncomfortable. Right.
Right.
I'm uncomfortable hearing anybody call somebody a saboteur. Everybody there is trying to advance their political needs. They have a political agenda. The Israeli people in a democracy have a right to say, you know, the agenda of so-and-so appeals to me or it doesn't appeal to me. And it's interesting, you know, when people say, Laura, that Netanyahu appeals to people's fear, I say to myself, people are afraid.
No, it's of course it's a legitimate.
He's not appealing to that. What he's saying is, there's a reality that we're living with. I understand my approach to it, and if my approach in some way represents what you'd like, you should vote for me. And so I'm uncomfortable when it's framed as if there's something devious about Netanyahu. Right. He's just a politician. By the way, I want him. You were brave enough to say you support Netanyahu. I want to make my position clear on this. My position is I'm not an Israeli. I don't vote. If the Israeli people want to once again somehow put Netanyahu as the head of the coalition government, they have every right to do so.
Of course, I just
and
meant,
I don't understand why American Jews are offended. If, on the other hand, the Israeli people wanted to put Benny Gantz and blue and white to make him the prime minister, fine. Let's see where that goes. And I wouldn't consider anything. I wouldn't need to say anything of a pejorative nature, either about Netanyahu or about Benny Gantz or Avigdor Lieberman or Kachlon.
it's not our
Yeah,
What I hear from American Jews, and one of the reasons I wanted all three of you here was because I wanted to hear your reaction after. What I hear is we're not sure exactly why Netanyahu didn't. There can be different arguments. But the question is, what should the American Jewish reaction be to the fact that, you know what, they went to the polls, and when it was all said and done, when the smoke cleared, nobody, and Netanyahu's in the nobody, could put a coalition government together. Laura, should it say anything to American Jews one way or the other than, isn't that interesting?
So it's interesting. I appreciate you sharing your perspective because I take a very different one. When talking to a lot of Israeli activists, both on the left and the right about this, I hear a range of opinions. And it seems that historically the only people uncomfortable with kind of interjecting in American politics, in Israeli politics from America are perhaps coming from, I don't want to say it's a naive place, but one of the biggest papers, Israel Hayom, is funded by Sheldon Adelson. He has no problem interfering in the way that Israeli politics
Sheldon
happens on the
Adelson's
ground.
newspaper is in Israel.
Correct.
Nobody has to read it.
Right. No, I'm just saying I don't think American Jews don't have to.
But that's not a fair analogy.
Okay.
Show me American, and by the way, I didn't say we can't care. But I don't understand why we should be upset.
well,
I don't think it's that people are upset, but I do think that American Jews, if we make the claim that Israel is the homeland of the Jewish people, which I personally strongly believe, then American Jews should feel comfortable voicing opinions about what happens there. I'm not saying it's an anger thing.
We are Jewish after all.
Yeah, no,
Right.
I agree.
Yeah.
I'm only saying, and you may know very well-educated American Jews. Most American Jews I talk to, they get their news from the New York Times, MSNBC, Fox, CNN. They rarely get it from the State of Israel itself. And like everything else today, people read newspapers that they feel represents where they are already. So if there's somebody who reads Haaretz, they're going to get one perspective. If they read the Times of Israel, they're going to get another perspective. They read Israel Hayom, they're going to give it another perspective. But they're here in America. And all I'm saying is, I find this development on the Israeli political scene fascinating and worth, sort of breaking down. But I don't feel it that in some way I I must characterize any one of these politicians in Israel who are doing nothing more than the following. Here's my platform. Here I am. I'm trying to win a vote, which is like every other country in the world. Now, what do you say to this?
Well, it does some ways describe the hubris of American Jews when it comes to Israeli politics. Certainly, Irish Catholics don't respond this way about Ireland.
They don't care like we do.
Right, I know. Well, and Italian Americans do.
But that's Laura's point.
No, I
They
know.
don't
but,
care like we do.
Right, but some of it has to do, right. But there are many reasons for why that is different.
Right.
But I also think that Donald Trump has a role here, because the American Jewish left in particular has such a strong visceral reaction to Trump. And I think it has collided, it has cascaded into this election because of the chumminess that the Trump administration has
And
with,
I want to make sure we understand
with
what
the
you're saying.
Netanyahu government.
Are you saying that it impacted the Israeli vote, or that it's impacting how American Jews look at this?
Absolutely, it's the
Which
latter.
one?
The latter, right? That you're asking, why do American Jews react this way about Netanyahu? I mean, why don't they just say, you're not, if you don't serve in the IDF and you're not living in Israel, you can be interested in the election as a diaspora Jew, but you shouldn't be nutty about it, right? You shouldn't be so angry. You should not be pounding your fist against the wall. You should say, well, this is the Israeli politics. It's a democracy, and this is what happens in a parliamentary democracy. But I do think that what you're seeing is such an unprecedented level of connection, intersection between between Trump and Netanyahu, that you're seeing a spillover. Certainly in blue states, certainly on the Upper West Side of New York, you're getting the same kind of spillover. And that doesn't apply to any of the other political figures. By the way, this is one of the reasons when we did election night coverage. I mean, I thought it was a colossal defeat even then for Netanyahu, even though he won, in theory. Because I thought, well, wait a minute, this is a guy who managed an economic boom during these years for Israel, and who presided over a country that has certainly, its national security is intact. But more importantly, what the Israelis are in love with is the move of the embassy move to Jerusalem, the decertification of the Iran deal, the annexation of the Golan. This has all been done under his watch. And he said, look, and now we have this new ultimate deal that's coming out. And you really want me as the manager during this period of time. I have been successful. I've not been unsuccessful prime minister. I've been an overly successful prime minister. In fact, I think Laura's point was about blue and white, which I think the key point she was making was to say, they could have governed together, because when it came to national security, Gantz, who was former military chief of staff, and Netanyahu were virtually identical. In fact, many people criticize Gantz and blue and white for not distinguishing themselves enough from Netanyahu. Said, you might have had a chance if you could have gone to the Israeli people and showed them why you're not Netanyahu light. You seem to be Netanyahu. So I look at it and I still see that this is, to me, a colossal defeat, what's happened here to Netanyahu, because by Israel's own standards, they have to look at this and say, he's been a successful prime minister. We're tired of him. We don't like him. The corruption stuff is upsetting. But remember, it was shortly before the election that we had rockets from Gaza that were actually hitting things. Normally, they don't hit houses. They're actually hitting houses. And I remember thinking at that time, well, that's clearly in Netanyahu's favor, right? Because I'm your wartime prime minister. I'm the one who knows what happens in these situations. So I do think that your point is still the greater point, which is, well, why are we invested in this way with such a visceral level? And I think some of it is the spillover with Trump.
Okay. I want to point out to you, Likud won more seats this time than last time.
I know.
Okay.
And you said that to me on election night.
So I'm
you
not
said the same thing to me when you said, why do you think this is a defeat? You said you didn't like it when I said it.
And I think to myself, you remember when Great Britain voted Churchill out?
Yeah, astonishing.
This is Churchill.
Yeah.
Right at the day after World War II.
I am with you. You're right.
So it doesn't work that way. What seems like it's so obvious, things are going well, why change things? A lot of people don't like Netanyahu in Israel. A lot of people said, we're just tired, how long should any one person be in the top leadership position? And so I thought it was, many people have said to me, no, this is the end. Blue and white, going to win. Well, it turned out they were wrong. And it turned out that Netanyahu was around to fight another day. And then it's interesting to me, he could not put a coalition together.
But they were wrong because the left, the far left, was completely feckless and, ineffectual, right? I mean,
in Israel or
in
in
Israel, right? The real problem was the fringe coalition partners.
Oh, when you say fact, how many votes did Meretz get? How many seats did Meretz get?
Four
yeah.
seats. This is the
labor.
Well,
but
it's
Meretz
really sad,
represents the left ideology in Israel.
Yeah.
All I'm saying is, do the Israeli people? I think the election shows something about the Israeli people. What it shows is the Israelis are not American Jews.
Absolutely. I want to touch on that, if I may.
Good point.
The left in Israel has not been in power for a long time. The last time it was in power was in 1992, when we actually had an ideologically center-left or left leader. And a very interesting voting trend that I wrote on in this election is that the opposite of American Jews, younger Israeli Jews, tend to the right.
Interesting.
And older Jews tend to the left.
Interesting.
And you actually saw a split when forced to pick, I believe, a week or so before the election. The Israeli Democracy Institute did a poll and asked voters to choose between Gantz and Netanyahu for prime minister. And the split between 18 to 24-year-olds and those 65 and older was fascinating. It was something like 75-25 preferred Netanyahu. And part of that is what you're talking about. They really have only grown up with Netanyahu in power, but also I don't say that he taps into fear as a negative thing. Both the left and the right in Israel tap into fear. The left, Micah Goodman writes about this, taps into the fear of the occupation, while the right taps into security fears. So I don't think that tapping into fear is bad. I just think that that's the political reality in Israel. Mm-hmm. But it's really, I mean, it's sad that these young Jews only know a situation in which their only experience with Gaza has been with rockets coming out of it or being sent in as IDF soldiers. So there's not a lot of, they haven't seen a successful left. They haven't seen that ideology being successful. So it makes a lot of sense that young Jews in Israel would be more to the right.
Very interesting. As you listen to this, thoughts?
Well, I see Netanyahu as kind of a historic figure. I admit that I'm taking kind of more of a, you guys are so versed in the intricacies, which is amazing, of the election and the system itself. I'm thinking back to the 1990s, actually, when the Oslo peace process was in full swing, and I remember the days of Yasser Arafat, Bibi Netanyahu, and Bill Clinton sitting on TV, and Bibi Netanyahu losing power, losing his prime ministership because he would not push forward with a peace process that had no foundation. You had incitement by Yasser Arafat the whole time, the whole way through, and at a certain point, after I think nearly 1,000 Israelis had been murdered, Bibi Netanyahu said enough, he wouldn't move forward. And remember, then he was voted out for that. So I think he does have Israel's interests at heart, Israel's security. Whatever his flaws may be, I believe his heart is there, and that he will hopefully survive this, and I think the country needs him. I think we need him. I think world Jewry needs him. I think he's brought us through before, and politics is sometimes a nasty game wherever you are, here or there, and his other problems and issues I can't speak to, but I do believe his heart is there with the security, and I would like to see him find a way to come through this.
Okay. And again, I'm not so interested in his heart at the moment. What I'm interested in is the dynamic of the political system in Israel. Mm-hmm. And I'll say this again. When all the smoke cleared in April, and lo and behold, it looked like there was the ability to create a right-leaning coalition government with Netanyahu at its head, and many American Jews were very upset for. And by the way, I'm not upset that American Jews are upset. That's not what I'm saying. American Jews, and you're right, we care deeply, and we care from different perspectives, and there are
Right.
different perspectives even around this table. That's fine. But then the question becomes, as American Jews watching, gee, how's the political process going to work itself out? I expected, and I think many American Jews expected, and you can tell me because you're in this day to day, you're in the trenches. I expected Netanyahu to be able to do this. I thought once he came out with the same number of seats as blue and white, and there was an obvious right-wing majority there, that he was going to be able to fashion it. He hit a very serious roadblock. From American Jewish perspective, it's often about Jewish pluralism in Israel. And is there going to be something done at the Western Wall? That's not an Israeli perspective.
Right, not at all.
Okay. The Israeli perspective is twofold. Number one, are we going to be safe? And you described that very, very well. And it's not a negative for Israelis to want to be safe. And then the other question is going to be, how are all the disparate groups that make up the State of Israel, the Olim from Ethiopia,
Exactly.
from Russia, who have not been accepted by the Orthodox mainstream establishment in Israel, how are they going to be treated? And what is the State of Israel going to say about the contribution of all of its citizens, including the Haredi, in the labor force and in serving in the military? And Lieberman, who has had a very checkered sort of, I sometimes have no idea where it's going to come out. He has taken a principled position which said, in essence, you either agree to back a bill that will force Haredi to be drafted, or I will not be in the coalition government. Once he said that, it didn't seem to me, Laura, that Netanyahu had the numbers anymore. It's a pure numbers game.
Right.
Do you think I'm right? Were there numbers that Netanyahu could have played differently that would have enabled him to overcome this? Or did the issue of Haredi service in the military sink any chance of a coalition government led by Netanyahu?
There's a lot to unpack there. I don't want to either over or understate the importance of the issue of Haredim serving in the military. However, I think it was almost coincidental that this was the issue that broke the coalition. There were a myriad of ways it could have fallen apart. The math was always going to be really tight. And we don't know all the backroom deals that happen. I don't think that's a bad thing, personally. But there's a lot to be said about both pluralism in Israel and about the Haredi issue. But it's not that, I want to just say one thing, it's not that Israeli Jews don't care about pluralism per se. It's more that they care if they can take a bus on Shabbat or if they can get married without the rabbinate's oversight than about the issues that American Jews care about. So I do think that that's one point of disconnect, is when we hear, a secular Jew fighting for religious pluralism in Israel, we might assume that that means something very different than what
Good for you.
they're actually doing.
Although I didn't hear that as an issue by any of the candidates in the State of Israel. I didn't hear somebody say, vote for me and you don't have to worry about a Shabbat bus.
Well, it was interesting. I always watch all of the political ads.
Yes.
And the Haredi parties actually made an appeal to secular voters this year, which was very interesting. I don't know how they thought that was going to work. But I do want to say there's a significant percentage of Israel. I come from I'm Orthodox. And, to them, it's not, we don't want to serve in the military because we don't. To them, it's Torah is an important part of being in Israel. And this is an institution that's part of it being a Jewish state. And I don't want to say that concern trumps Lieberman's concern or vice versa. But there is a big percentage of Israel and a growing percentage of Israel, their birth rate, both here and in Israel, is going to really shift the dynamic and the breakdown between Orthodox and secular.
Again, fascinating. Just one personal moment here. You said you're Orthodox. Did you say you have family in Israel that's Orthodox?
I do not have family in Israel who's
Okay.
Orthodox.
But your community here, you were reflecting in some way an attitude of your American Orthodox community. You know, there's a big difference between Orthodox and Haredi.
Well, correct. Haredi would be what some people might call ultra-Orthodox.
There are many Orthodox in Israel who serve in the IDF.
And
Many.
For sure. No,
We're talking about a
right,
very
correct.
specific
Correct.
and
I'm
narrow.
not Haredi. I'm Orthodox,
Right.
and the Haredi is a different.
Right. So
There's
when
religious Zionists who are Orthodox.
So when
yes.
you quote your community,
I meant the broader Orthodox
yes, but your community isn't the problem.
But they understand. I don't like putting it that way, because when I speak to other Orthodox Jews, even those who are more on the modern end of the spectrum,
Yes.
we support those institutions. A lot of us send money to those institutions. So I wouldn't say that, modern Orthodox Jews, children often serve in the military, therefore we don't understand the Haredi complaint. There is a lot of connection
Yes,
between
if
the
you're
Orthodox
saying
communities.
that you and your community understands the Haredi perspective, well, good for you, and I wish every American Jew did. These are not bad people. They have a different view, and their view is, by studying Torah, they are furthering the future of the Jewish people.
Right.
And look, there are some within the Haredi community, even in Israel, who don't accept the state of Israel as a viable Jewish state, and they don't want to contribute in that way. But many of them, that's not the issue. The issue for them is they're committed to studying Torah, and the Jewish world has always put a value on that. The state of Israel is struggling with it, not me. The state of Israel is trying to decide
Right.
to what extent do we say, yes, we appreciate the emphasis on Torah. And the problem is, when Ben-Gurion made the deal, there were 7. Now there are 7 million. And that's the difference. At one point, it didn't seem to be something that would matter. Now we understand the population of the Haredi community in Israel is so large that it matters, and so Israelis do care. And they do care about whether they can take a bus on Shabbat, which is different than whether they can stand in a section of the Western Wall. But you are correct. What are you thinking now?
Well, I was actually curious as to whether, I remember hearing that there were some units of ultra-Orthodox soldiers in the IDF, and I guess these
There are.
gradations,
Yeah. No,
there
there
are
are.
a lot of, yes, so that was one question. And yeah, I mean, from my vantage point, as an American Jew who loves Israel, but I'm not super religious myself, and I'm a student of history and of politics and character, again, it's just very interesting to think in terms of the characters here and the personalities. I think, I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anybody. As you say, these are all politicians. They have to operate and maneuver. From my vantage point, it seemed to me like Lieberman found the perfect issue here, because this is a legitimate issue and an ongoing debate, and a lot of passions and sincerely held convictions about it. And I'm not saying that it isn't a sincere issue for him, but it was a very strategically smart thing. I mean, he really, picked something that, puts Bibi in a very, very tough spot.
You continue to frame this as if he was manipulative.
Well, they think they all are. I mean, they have to be. This
politics.
is the nature.
Yes,
of
okay.
I'm not necessarily saying it's something about their character. I'm just saying that there's a lot of
No,
strategizing.
but you make it sound like he said to himself, gee, how can I find an issue? Oh, I know what issue. As opposed to
might
it
have.
being, but it also could be an organic concern
or
of his.
both. Yeah. It's
And- I think
it's
strategic.
both,
He's
yeah,
a chess
yeah.
player. All I'm
Yeah.
saying is that it was a smart move if he wanted Bibi on the ropes. I can't speculate as to. I won't speculate as to his
Okay,
heart.
and
Well, it could have come down to security also. He's to the right of Bibi on security. He could have said, I want you
Believe
to
that he's-
dramatically change your Gaza strategy. Like, it could have been, there's a lot of little
the two of
ways.
them are now warring. Netanyahu and Lieberman are warring, and Netanyahu is telling Lieberman
Gantz
he's
too,
on the
right?
left, and
Right.
Lieberman saying, I'm on the left, I live on the West Bank, you live wherever you live, you're out of your mind.
Well,
and it's Israeli politics.
I think what Bibi means is, I wouldn't presume to speak for him, but from my vantage point, it seemed like he was saying, this is jeopardizing a a coalition that would be a strong, security-minded coalition.
Yes.
So you're on the left because you may
That doesn't put
result
him on
in
the
my.
left, though.
I mean,
Well,
let's not be coy here. Netanyahu wants to be prime minister. The biggest insult in politics in Israel for a long time has been Smolani, you're a leftist. What else would you say to someone you want to disparage? Like that, I don't think we need to like make a huge deal out of it. He wants to be PM. Lieberman right now has the crazy position that no one saw him being in ever of being a kingmaker. Of course he's going to call him a leftist. He would call him a rightist if that were the insult, you know?
It's still
strategic,
silly.
yeah.
It's still silly.
It's definitely silly.
What are you thinking here?
Well, it's not just a draft bill. During this period of time where Netanyahu was trying to form a coalition government, you started to hear in Israel that the Haredi parties, the 16 seats, were angling for certain ministry positions that freaked people out. For instance, they were looking, well, you know, maybe we could become the justice minister. What about the education minister? When Israelis hear that, you know what they think? They think, oh, great, now who's going to be a Jew? They're going to decide who's going to be a Jew, who can be a rabbi, and who can pray in front of the Western Wall. And so that also, it wasn't just the draft bill. I think that Lieberman tapped into something that was beyond military.
Totally.
It was beyond it. The minute they invoke the words justice ministry and education ministry, and they're saying,
Yeah.
for the love of God, there's 16 of you.
Literally,
And
yeah.
16 of you, you want the justice and education. We know what you're about. We know what you want. We want you want to decide what women can do, what men can do, what a reformed rabbi can be, who gets to stand near the wall, who has to stand somewhere else. And so I think it's the bill beyond. It was the draft bill, but it's beyond that. I also think that, you know, we have to think about how extraordinary this was, because it shows the limitations of coalition politics in Israel. The whole point of coalition politics is we're all right wing, but we have different tastes within the right wing. But we have to subordinate, compromise some of our first principles in order to be in the government. And what we saw this time, they said, no.
Yeah, well, I think that's
No,
Netanyahu's position.
we don't need to do
I
that.
think he's saying, you know, listen, let's stick together here, folks,
Yeah.
because we're all, you know, we're conservatives, we're security hawks, we need to batten down the hatches, and he views Lieberman's decision as a you know, betrayal of that.
Laura, if they have elections in September, what's going to change?
That is a great question that anyone that tells you they know the answer to is lying about. I guess the best way to look at it is what has changed. Not really a lot, except that it's a little bit clearer that Netanyahu wants to pass the types of bills that analysts thought he was going to want to pass that would give him immunity. So perhaps we might see something where Israeli voters that didn't catch on that that was something he was going to try to do might say, okay, maybe I'll give Gantz a shot. Maybe people are going to be really upset that it came down to a capitulation to the ultra-Orthodox. You know, one thing that the most stable voting bloc in Israel is the Haredi bloc, because in a lot of these communities, your Rebbe tells you who to vote for, and I'm not being cynical, that's the reality, and people follow the Rebbe's orders. And everyone else, you know, polling in Israel is notoriously fickle. I'm a numbers person, because you call them up and they say, I don't know, I'll decide on the day of. So, you know, all of this polling is never consistent and it's never accurate. So I think a lot of it's going to come down to, are there, you know, God forbid, more terrorist attacks? Do we see escalating tensions with Iran and the United States? Does Trump campaign really, really hard for Netanyahu? I think it's more about what is happening in the outside world and how that impacts the reality. And of course, if Netanyahu does his usual strategy of a lot of last-minute outreach, that might, you know, give him 36 seats or something like that.
36 won't be enough.
Right, right.
Well, except that I think the wild card, I think you might have mentioned it earlier, is Shaked and Bennett.
Right.
Because
They were 1,500 votes short.
Right.
By the way, that was shocking.
And we
to
were
me.
here that night.
Yeah.
Shocking.
We couldn't believe. Remember, they came off the came off the board.
Naftali Bennett
Yeah.
doesn't have any position now.
Well,
He doesn't have a
it's
seat?
weird because he's in the unusual position where he's the education minister and not in
It's
Knesset.
bizarre, isn't it bizarre?
Yeah, yeah.
And Ayelet Shaked was a rising star,
Mm-hmm.
and both of them just gone.
They'll be back.
But
They'll
that's
be
why
back.
that's
They'll
why
be
I'm
back.
saying that if Shaked joins Likud, if he can somehow bring her in, I think we have ball game. Also, Gideon Sa'ar is another wild card here, right? He's the fourth or fifth guy on the slate.
Yeah.
He's young, telegenic, Likudnik, super popular in Israel. He would be like the Beto O'Rourke, I guess, or Mayor Pete. Gideon Sa'ar, many people knew that Netanyahu didn't want him to be the number 2 guy on the slate, because if he was the number 2 guy on the slate, Rivlin could have turned to him and said, you know what, there's nothing that prohibits Rivlin from saying, I don't think Netanyahu could do it, but I can go to the second guy on the slate. So that's why he ended up as the 5th guy on the slate. But I'm wondering now if the Likudniks panic and say, we're going to be out of the government, so we have to push someone in front of the voters, and it's not going to be Netanyahu. I can't imagine this happening, but he is now the most popular politician in Israel, this young guy who is still sitting 5th on the list, and if he could be moved up, he might have been given the task of forming a government.
I asked Laura, I'm asking you, what's going to be different this time?
Look, I still think Netanyahu is going to win. I'm throwing out all these things. I just don't see how.
But when you say win,
Yeah, he's going to.
he
Find
can't
a
win
way.
He
alone.
will-
He can only win with a coalition.
I think he is
Right.
going to peel away. He's going to do what I said sort of off when we talked tonight, today. He tried to do this, but he did obliquely to say, I know you think you're voting for me if you're voting for right-wing parties because you're voting for the coalition and I'm the head of the coalition and they will pick me as the head of the coalition. But look what just happened. Look what just happened. Don't do this again. We're going to spend tens of millions of dollars on another election, and we've got
Hundreds of millions.
hundreds of millions of dollars. We're upsetting Trump and family because they want to unveil a peace plan, and they are depending on me as being the president. He's going to say this. He's going to say.
So are
that
you
Trump-
suggesting he will get more votes? Which is
I think he's going to get more votes, and I think that there's a chance that he's going to recruit Shaked, and he's going to peel some votes away from the right-wing parties, and then he'll have 61 and more.
I do
Okay,
want to know one
what's gonna
other
happen?
thing when you're done
Perhaps,
that's different.
Hashem will lend a hand. Seriously, I think that security is very important, and I think that if it's maybe he'll help those who help themselves, and that includes Bibi. That's my hope.
out of curiosity, Heather, when you talk about integrity, to what extent do the charges against Netanyahu bother you?
Well, they're charges, they're accusations, and we don't know what is and isn't true.
So it doesn't bother you at the moment?
Well, I believe in that
So?
people need to be this needs to be unearthed and examined in a methodical way, not tried in the media.
Okay.
That
so
was
Laura,
the thing I was going to
yeah.
mention that's different. Netanyahu is in active pre-indictment hearings. By the time we get to September, he's going to, be very close to being indicted. Like, the evidence is out there, both in the media and in the court's records. So that's the reason one of the many reasons he's panicking about not having this coalition, because in some ways he needed to be prime minister to avoid accountability for these 3 cases that are against him
Yes.
right now.
For you, the word integrity would not be a word
Look,
you used with him.
I think the principle that you mentioned earlier in kind of roundabout ways of judging others favorably is very important, but I don't know that his actions are accountable to the law in every situation.
So you're a lawyer. To what extent do you say, because of how I feel about him as an Israeli leader, when I look at the charges against him, they look pretty sound to me, and it's very upsetting that this could be true about a prime minister? Or do you say this is political nonsense? It's minor stuff, and that it should not affect how the Israeli people feel about him when they go to the polls to determine their next prime minister.
Well, I just want to say on the record that historically the Jewish people have had flawed leaders. King
Yes.
David, let's go all the way back.
Amen.
You know, I mean, they've never had, you know, King David was a very flawed man. King Solomon was flawed. And in Israel, they've had presidents go to prison. They've had prime ministers go to prison. This is not one of Israel's strengths, integrity in public life. So
Or one could say Israel pulls the veil back. And
Yes.
in other cultures, the
Well,
veil is maintained.
don't
So
get me started
give-
compared to the
give
Islamic
Israel,
Arab world.
Yes, but give Israel credit.
Yeah, of course, yes. This is what I say all the time when, you know, people want to bash Israel. I said, show me a country anywhere near them that has this level of vibrancy, robustness, critical inquiry into who we are, respect for the rule of law, religious freedom and pluralism.
Okay, but I interrupted you.
And in fact, sends their prime ministers to jail.
Yeah.
And sends their presidents to jail. No one is
No
above.
prime minister yet.
Right, no.
But president,
President-
yes.
Well,
And
we've had
prime ministers
presidents,
have
we've had fallen
Prime
prime
ministers have
ministers,
fallen.
including the venerable Rabin, Yitzhak Rabin. People forget had fallen from this, and let's just not forget. I just think in terms of not corruption, but something else. This was something I wanted to say earlier. This dissolution bill is worth discussing for a moment too, because what made this unprecedented is that Benny Gantz wasn't given a chance to form a government. By voting on the bill, it dispensed with what normally, which was the point
That's
that Heather was making before, which is normally in a parliamentary system, the president would have said to the party who had won the most seats, the largest coalition, go make it work.
By the way, just to make sure people understand, Likud did not win more seats.
No, but as a coalition, the idea... Right.
It looked like other parties said to Rivlin, we'll join.
Which is required, by the way,
Yes,
when he interviewed all the parties.
It was recommended
Yes.
He
by
has
most.
to say,
Exactly right.
each of them said, we're going to go with,
Right.
we think he's our guy.
But your point is that the normal process is if one person and one party can't do it, can't put the coalition government, the president of Israel then says to the next party, you try.
And you know who
Bibi
became,
didn't do that,
and,
right?
you know,
That
he
was
did
his
Let me just say,
strategic-
right, that's
Uh-huh.
where he shows the point that Laura made earlier, how really politically savvy he is. Because he decided, I could be out of this position
Right.
if Gantz is given a chance. Maybe Gantz will find a way to pull together people that we don't even think of, that he can form a government. The best shot I have is a new election without giving Gantz a chance.
And that
so
was
that's what
unprecedented.
unprecedented,
Right,
that he said,
okay.
let's just have a bill that just dissolves Parliament, Knesset altogether.
Okay.
So, so I just think that part is incredibly important because it gave a new lease of life on the theory that he could win in this next election.
Exactly. We have only moments left. I want for you, Heather, as you look at the way the Jewish community relates to Israel, in 30 seconds, what's your sense of how American Jewry now will react to the state of Israel? Will this matter to American Jews, or is it, again, sort of very interesting, but so what?
I think it will matter because I think, as in many times, we're at a precarious place. We need to be a community. We need to come together, especially around security issues, and we've seen, issues here in this country. So the idea of Israel as a separate place, of course, we're proud Americans, number one, but we have that tie, and it's both a tie of the heart and of personal security importance to many Americans. So I think we're watching closely.
Laura, what do you think? What will there be an impact on the way American Jews view the state of Israel because of this?
I think there's two groups that I want to separate, which is American Jews and Americans. And I think both of them are impacted by this in different ways. American Jews, vast majority, over 90%, express an affinity with Israel and say that's an important part of their Jewish identity. A tiny percentage express that getting into the weeds is something that they're interested in. Most American Jews historically are Democrats. They do not like Trump. There's a phenomenon that Thane mentioned of Israel being tainted by Trump. And because of the close relationship he has with Netanyahu, I don't think they want Netanyahu to be in power. Americans as a whole also are impacted by that trend. I did a piece 2 years ago about how you can actually see in Pew and Gallup's reporting, when you cluster questions about Trump near questions about Israel, it impacts how people answer positively about Israel. So I think the idea of Israel as a flourishing Jewish democracy is not impacted. I think the affinity that Americans and American Jews have for the current political aberrations is definitely going to be negatively impacted.
Look, if you go to a Shabbat dinner on the Upper West Side, you're going to get people who just hate Trump and hate Netanyahu. But if you really ask them, tomorrow rockets are firing from both Lebanon.
They want a strong leader.
Right. If tomorrow you've got Iran talking about wiping Israel off the map. You've got rockets from the north from Hezbollah. You've got rockets from the south coming from Gaza. Who's your prime minister? And I think most people in that situation are going to say, I'm not ready to move to Benny Gantz.
Yeah, we rarely disagree, and sometimes it's only nuance. If you're talking about the Upper West Side, I don't think you're right.
You're saying they
come
would
to
never,
my table.
Right,
the Orthodox community does not feel
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with
way.
that too. I'm just saying that when you look at the Pew polls, there are some remarkable things. For instance, 75% of American Jews said that they blamed in the Gaza war Hamas more than Israel. 75% American Jews said that they did not think that Israel's defensive measures, counterstrikes, were disproportionate. That's extraordinary, because you wouldn't hear that on the Upper West Side, right? And certainly Bernie Sanders would never say anything like that. So I just think that when push comes to shove, but you're right, the Upper West Side is a special species of Jewish, communal gatherings. But I do think most American Jews, the Jews from St. Louis, for instance, in a situation like this,
They're very different.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
And it's true about America as a whole and about the American Jewish community as a whole. I've loved listening to your analysis and your reactions. You're very thoughtful. I hope the sense of optimism that I hear undercurrent here, I hope it's true. I worry that there's a large segment of American Jewry which just despises Trump, and it has spilled over. They didn't like Netanyahu before Trump. They just don't like him more now. And that I worry that in some way this election will be seen as a failure of the Israeli system. And I don't want that to happen.
But what is the point you made earlier? I thought was the key point, that in fact it's actually a triumph.
From my perspective,
Actually.
it is. And I would encourage American Jews to say the following. How interesting. Let's see where this plays out. And I hope all of you are around as we watch this over the next few months. It has been wonderful having you at this table.
Thank you.
And Laura, you're outstanding, just wonderful. And you, my friend, you'll always be on my right side. So I thank all three of you. I hope we continue the discussion as the months move along.
I enjoyed
Thank you all.
sharing the show with
Wasn't it
our new
wonderful?
friends. They're wonderful.
Thanks for having us.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
very much. The thoughts of Thane Rosenbaum, Laura E. Adkins, and Heather Robinson. I hope you enjoyed hearing all of their analysis here on JBS. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. Be well, my friends.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.